We're recording this on September 11th, the anniversary of the deadliest and most destructive attacks on American soil in U.S. history. Every year around this time, I think, so what have we learned about terrorism, about jihadism, about the enemies of America, America's allies, and Western civilization? More importantly, what have we failed to learn about those who still are waging a jihad against us? Today, I'm also thinking about the Israeli strike against leaders of Hamas who have been living high on the hog, one might say, in Qatar. Hamas is a jihadi terrorist organization, a militaristic branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose openly stated goal is genocidal, the annihilation of Israel and the extermination of Israelis. I've also been thinking about the Houthis, who control much of Yemen. They too proclaim themselves jihadis, and stopping them from firing missiles at merchant ships and Israel has proven surprisingly challenging. Who better to discuss all this with than Edmund Fitton-Brown, a former British ambassador to Yemen, a former coordinator of the UN Security Council's monitoring team for Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban, and a frequent panelist on Generation Jihad, a podcast hosted by my FDD colleague Bill Roggio. I'm proud to say Ambassador Fitton-Brown is now a senior fellow here at FDD, and he's with us today in our cozy podcast studio. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're with us too, here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome to the studio, welcome to the headquarters, welcome to the FDD team, as it were.
Thanks, Cliff. It's great to be here.
Actually start by telling us about yourself. I mean, how did you get into the terrorism business, as it were?
Well, I suppose I started off in the UK Foreign Service. I became an Arabist, learned Arabic from 1990 to 1992, and then did a series of postings in the region, including Cairo, Kuwait, Riyadh, Jeddah, Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and I finished up, as you mentioned earlier, as the British ambassador to Yemen. So if you work in that area for such a long time, of course you end up being heavily preoccupied with counterterrorism, because sadly that has been one of the defining features of British interests in the region.
What years were you in Yemen?
So I didn't serve in Yemen because of the civil war.
You were
I used to visit Yemen regularly from Dubai because I had a regional role.
Right.
Then they appointed me as ambassador. And then, of course, the Houthis took Sana'a, and we tried to stay for a while. The British and American embassies stayed open in Sana'a for a few months after the Houthis took the capital. But eventually it became unsustainable. And my predecessor had to evacuate along with her American counterpart. And I was then left with the task of deciding where I should serve this particular mission. And I decided to open the embassy in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Jeddah's a rather nice town, actually.
Yes.
We're going to come back to that, but tackle the question that I raised in my introduction about 9/11, what we have learned and maybe what we have failed to learn, which I'm sure you've thought about this too, and probably more so on anniversaries. It's a time to think about this
Absolutely.
stuff.
And in fact, oddly enough, one of my proudest publications was a year ago when the CTC Sentinel from West Point gave me the cover feature on the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. And so I wrote a long piece about the state of the global jihadi threat 23 years on from 9/11. And yeah, it is a combination of, the story that we can tell from the past 23 years is a mix. There's a lot of learning that's happened and a lot has been achieved. And one of the problems in counterterrorism, of course, is that the best news stories very often don't get told. And that's all to do with the disruption of terrorist plots. Because although there have been a number of terrorist plots that have come to fruition over the past 23 years, and I'm happy to say not so many over the last decade or so, since ISIS passed its sort of high water mark. But, there have been attacks. People have been killed. There have been attacks in London. There have been attacks in Europe, not very much in the United States. And what people tend not to know is that those successful attacks represent a tiny tip of the iceberg of the stuff underneath the water, which is a vast number of terrorist plots which are disrupted and fail.
I mean, I mean, the Taliban is back in control of Afghanistan. I must say, after 9/11, I thought we would never let that happen. I think it's a tremendous failure in many, many ways. I've said that in the past. Al-Qaeda is not what it used to be, but it's not gone. Islamic State, as you say, it was deprived of its territory. But organizations like Boko Haram still kill Christians in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, by the hundreds, which gets very little attention, actually. And then, of course, all the things we know of the Middle East. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not what it was, but it's not. It's not down, and it's maybe down. It isn't by no means out. Israel's still at war with Hamas. I mean, there's a lot that hasn't been achieved.
No, that is absolutely true. So, whereas if you like, technical counterterrorism has been pretty successful, the underlying causes of terrorism, which are often to do with conflict. You've got unresolved conflict in so many places around the world, and terrorist groups that are able to dominate areas or to terrorize populations. We don't tend to hear about these things. If you have a catastrophic situation, for example, the one in Burkina Faso or the one in Mali, people don't really take much interest in that in the West, but they do need to. And I agree with you. If you actually look at the things that have gone wrong, they portend a very difficult future, I think. And this is one of the things I argued in that article a year ago, which was to say that the loss of Afghanistan to the Taliban was a pretty disastrous event, and that we would suffer consequences from that in the future. The accession of Al-Qaeda as a sort of a semi-detached member of the Iranian-driven axis of, like they like to call it, the axis of resistance. I think we probably shouldn't allow them that title.
Right.
But we know what we mean by that. Normally, you would think of primarily Houthi or Hezbollah components of that, primarily groups that are either Shia or Shia adjacent. But of course, you've got Sunni groups like Hamas, who are part of it as well, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And interestingly, since the killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Saif al-Adl, of course, has been based in Tehran, in Iran. And what we've seen, and the effect of this has been very visible on the ground in Yemen, in the truce that has broken out between the Houthis and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You now have Al-Qaeda serving as a sort of as I say, a semi-detached member of this Iranian axis. And then I mentioned West Africa.
Yeah.
And here we have a real problem, because it seems to me that benign Western tutelage or Western influence, which existed, through the Americans in Niger, existed through the French in other parts of West Africa, existed through the United Nations as well, has been driven out. And it may be partly our own naivety. It may be that we didn't sort of stick to the real essentials of trying to make sure that these countries were as proof against terrorism as possible. But we're now in a sort of a dreadful situation where you have a number of coup governments which are increasingly out of touch with their populations. They've allied themselves with...
Like which countries do you have in mind here?
I'm thinking about Burkina Faso.
Right.
I'm thinking about Mali. I'm thinking about Niger. And the problem here is that those governments are increasingly unpopular.
Yeah.
And they've taken as allies the Russians.
The Russians rather than thhrowing out the French.
Yeah, and Russian mercenaries.
Yeah.
And to
Wagner Group in some cases, yeah.
Exactly.
Mali, yeah.
Yeah, and they've created a sort of you could well imagine what that looks like. I mean, if you're a sort of a military junta that's trying to hold on to power, you're not going to do very much to look after the interests of the people that you govern. B, you're going to sell out the country's resources to Russian mercenaries. And C, you've got a sophisticated enough enemy in Al-Qaeda through the actual group is known as Jainim, the group for Islam and Muslims, Jamaat al-Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin. And Jainim is pretty shrewd. So what they've started to do is to make themselves popular in localities that have spun out of the control of the capital, and people who feel as if the government doesn't represent their interests. And I can see one or more of these countries actually capsizing to Al-Qaeda control.
So explain this to me. So when a government like in Mali throws out the French and instead brings in the Russians, they're doing so to protect the ruling junta essentially, and they know the Russians are A, more ruthless, and B, more reliable. But they're also making it for a lot of people more persuasive that maybe they should be with the Islamists, that they'll be better rulers. Is that what's going on?
That's exactly what's going on. And so this, as you say about the Russians, they don't ask difficult questions.
Yeah.
One of the things that we had got ourselves into a cycle where we would nag these countries or hector them about their failure to live up to certain Western ideals. And I think we got away from the basics and allowed ourselves to effectively to become unpopular with those countries because we were, I think there are some things you can insist on. If you don't have the rule of law, your government will fail. But if you go too far in pushing a Western agenda, then you do alienate the locals.
Did the French do that? The French were often disliked. I spent a lot of time in West Africa, and they were often disliked just because of the old colonial power, and they were rather haughty. They were seen as, I think.
They were, and that is true. And the French are perhaps less guilty of the particular overreach that I'm referring to. But if you look at Mali, of course, it was very much a French sphere of influence.
Totally.
But it was also a huge UN mission there. And that UN mission made itself very unpopular because because of pursuing, issues that the Malians considered to be things that were luxuries that they couldn't really focus on. They needed to focus on, more basic support that they needed from the international community, and then they decided to look elsewhere.
Well, now that segues a little bit to the UN, which I wanted to talk to you about, because I think of the UN and maybe I'm going to be more critical than you are, not being interested in democracy. It's mostly most of the UN General Assembly members are authoritarians. The UN Security Council has China and Russia on it. And they are, I think, a closer relationship than at this point the U.S. is with either Britain or France in terms of voting. And the UN, I don't think it's necessarily anti-terrorism. It's anti-terrorism in some cases. It's Al-Qaeda, well, they'll agree, but Hamas, they don't agree that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They've never said so. I think I don't see the UN demanding an awful lot in terms of rule of law or human rights or any of the things that I, as an American, or would see as beneficial. Which is not to say I necessarily want to press it on anybody else, but I don't imagine the UN pushing for any of that. My experience with the UN in Africa, and I was an Africa correspondent for the New York Times back when, was that these were very nice people and very pleasant to go to dinner with, and they were accomplishing nothing that I could see at the UN development program or that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's quite harsh, but I don't entirely disagree with you either. And I think the other thing I would say about the UN is I think that it has got worse. So one of the things I would always say about the UN is that it contains multitudes. It's so large and it takes on far too many functions. I mean, that's one of the things because at some point we really do need to look at what is a realistic prospect for reforming the UN, because I don't think you can just abolish it. Sooner or later, you have to reinvent it. But it
not easy to do, not easy to reform. But go ahead. Yeah,
probably even harder to reinvent, I would. Yeah. So you need reform, and one of the things that I think has to stop is this taking on of endless superfluous missions, things which the UN is just not needed to do, or they're nice to have, but they're not really essential to have. Now, one of the reasons why we're always going to need the UN is that we're always going to have conflicts where every member state just ends up saying, we can't own this, we just can't deal with it. And you need somebody that you can sort of hand it to, as it were, and say, well, you're going to have to hold the ring. You can draw on support from member states, but you're going to have to be the people who actually take responsibility for doing what you can about this conflict. So I think one way or another, you need the UN to do that. And there are some areas of delivery where the UN has not been so bad. And the area that
Give me an example, because I'm thinking of UNIFIL, obviously, in Lebanon, where it's being wound down over the next year because it has been a failure. It established its bases, and it was meant to make sure that Hezbollah wasn't establishing its bases, and it didn't do so. It just didn't do so.
UNIFIL, a miserable failure.
Yeah.
UNRWA, even worse.
UNRWA,
not just a failure, but an absolute disgrace.
UNRWA, I didn't understand this, and I don't know, a year ago certainly. I thought UNRWA was complicit with Hamas, but the idea that it was essentially a division of Hamas, that only I realized relatively recently, and that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres would essentially say, "Yeah, well, I'm very protective of UNRWA."
Yeah.
I mean, what we have actually had is the UN refusing to deal with the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, saying that UNRWA had to distribute all food, or we don't recognize it as being distributed. We don't even count it. And then UNRWA saying, and we want the blue police to protect us. And the blue police is, of course, Hamas.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Hamas.
No, it's absolutely shocking. And if we start to catalogue the UN's failings on Israel, we could go on for a very,
very long podcast. Yeah.
But UNRWA is absolutely beyond the pale. It's unconscionable. And another one that is unconscionable was the renewal of the mandate of Francesca Albanese.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Which you will have noticed earlier this year. And that was not just in the teeth of American opposition, that was in the teeth of European opposition as well. She is such a compromised and dreadful figure that the British, the French, and the Germans were also against her renewal, and yet Guterres just pressed on regardless. So he has.
Well, he claimed that I have nothing to do with this. It's the decision of the UN Human Rights Council. It's not my decision. Of course, that's another compromised organization or corrupt organization. The UN Human Rights Council, right? It's filled with chronic human rights abusers.
So she also misrepresented her own CV. I do not doubt for a minute that the United Nations, if it had been determined enough, could have taken action against her on the basis of false representation of her credentials. But they just didn't.
She's not a serious.
She's not an international lawyer.
She's not an international lawyer.
Claimed to be a qualified international lawyer. So, in my view, I don't think that Guterres' denial in that area holds any water at all. And look at the inquiry into UNRWA and the way that they sort of said, oh, well, there were half a dozen people who seemed to have misbehaved and we've fired them. But they deliberately avoided addressing a whole range of other issues about, UNRWA staff who were directly involved in holding hostages, the fact that Hamas had deliberately built some of their tunnels underneath UNRWA facilities and were drawing power, sort of running cables from the, presumably all of their power being effectively paid for by the American taxpayer.
Yeah.
And so I think in this particular area, the UN is courting an absolute disaster. And that disaster may come to a head this month in New York, because as you know, the British, the French, the Canadians and the Australians have expressed their determination to recognize Palestine during the General Assembly this month. Now, for all sorts of reasons, I'm sure I don't need to convince you, this is a really bad policy.
Yeah.
They seem to want to do it anyway. They seem to have ignored some very strong warnings from the United States that this is undesirable and also directly unhelpful in terms of negotiations for a ceasefire and for the hostage release. And yet it looks like it's happening. Now, the United States has, in one sense, responded by refusing to allow entry to New York for the Palestinian delegation that would have come.
And this would have been from the Palestinian Authority, which just, I think most people listening know, has not had a presence in Gaza since 2007. It was thrown out by Hamas. Yeah,
exactly. But if you think about a possible perfect storm here that is brewing, which is this very well known and increasingly firmly expressed US concern about the way that the UN has behaved on this file, and you then add that to the US concern about the recognition of the Palestinian state and the implications of that for US attempts to resolve the crisis in Gaza, and imagine a General Assembly that becomes quite shrill and combative in terms that are directly offensive to the United States. I am concerned that this could actually bring the UN into a level of crisis with the US greater than it has before. And when you think that the US is the key hosting state for the UN, and it's also by far the major financial contributor to the UN, we could be moving towards a real moment of truth.
Well, there's the only way the UN reforms, it seems to me, maybe you have other thoughts on how it would happen. It would begin with the UN, with the U.S. Beginning to defund.
Yes.
Right now, the U.S. pays about a quarter of the UN's budget. The UN's total expenditures each year, I think, are over $70 billion at this point. As you say, taking on all kinds of missions that they will not be accomplished. I can certainly imagine President Trump saying we're spending way too much money there. Let's cut it way back and then see about what reforms there are before we bring any more revenue to this organization.
Exactly so. I mean, what's been happening up to now for some years has been that the US has been very, very slow to pay its dues to the UN. And that has been, in itself, has been a signal of disapproval of some of the ways in which the UN ignores the US. But I think that the UN expected to get away with this during the period of the Biden administration.
For sure.
I had expected that when President Trump was reelected, that we would have seen the UN trying to work out, well, this is going to be a rockier period. How do we show that we are serious about factoring in US concerns? But in many areas, it seems to me that the UN has doubled down.
Yeah, Gutierrez certainly has shown no interest in appeasing the U.S. or trying to show that he is reform. And he's been very friendly I believe he went to Beijing for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. I think he went to Kazan for some meeting that Putin had. I mean, he's been very friendly to all of them.
I was very struck by the time that he attended the BRICS meeting.
Yes.
And I don't know if you remember, but he has, perhaps it's not his fault, but he has a very unfortunate sort of physical manner. He looks as if he's bowing to people. And there is one still photograph of him appearing to bow to Putin. The failure of judgment, when you think that he's not a first-term Secretary General, he's deep into his second term.
Yes.
He should know better. If he'd been invited to a NATO event, first of all, he wouldn't have been, because NATO wouldn't have wanted to put him in that position. It wouldn't have wanted to create that appearance of partiality. Well, obviously, the BRICS had no such reservations about doing it, but that Guterres fell for that and actually allowed himself to be embarrassed by it.
Well, I suspect he's partial to BRICS. What is he? I mean, he is an Italian, Portuguese socialist. My guess is that he is very comfortable among BRICS and among other groups that are essentially hostile and antagonistic towards the United States.
That's exactly true. He is an old Portuguese socialist. Yeah. And the tragedy of it is he was thought worthy to take over this role as the world's top diplomat. And he hasn't apparently been able to rise above his origins.
Yeah. Yeah, but he isn't. As you say, he's in his second term. He may think I'm going to ride it out. What are they going to do to me? I can be what I want to be. I can't run for a third term. What do I care?
The thing is, he should at least be concerned about his legacy. He's tried. One of the legacies he's tried for has been gender parity. Now, that has involved the deliberate appointment of senior UN officials as women. Women to those roles. If he had really wanted an impact on that, he would have stood down after the first term. He would have said, I'm actually going to forswear a second term on the condition that it's recognized that my successor should be a woman. But, there's no sincerity in what he does.
No.
He considers himself to be indispensable, regardless of his gender.
Right. And he's made climate change an issue, which I think he knows nothing about. Anything else at this? This is the 80th UNGA, UN General Assembly session. I think it opened already on the September 9th. And then the high-level general debate, so-called, begins on September 23rd. Besides this recognition of a Palestinian state, which doesn't have borders, doesn't have leaders, doesn't have an economy, doesn't really exist. It's performative. What else do you see, if anything, happening that we should be looking for at this session?
Well, this is going to be the first General Assembly of President Trump's second term. So people are going to come to New York and they're going to express views on things that have happened over the past 9 months, 8 months rather. There will be, What do we think of the US strikes on Iran, for example? And there may be comments about tariff diplomacy and things of that kind. And so my concern is that this is going to be quite a shrill General Assembly. I mean, of course, it's not unusual for foreign leaders to come to New York and make shrill speeches. That's happened in the past. But I worry that if you like, the sort of the cumulative sense of anti-Americanism or anti-Israeli sentiment is going to be so predominant that it's going to leave a lot of Western allies, and primarily the United States, looking at this and saying, what's the point? What is the point of this? And I think the UN does have a point still, but it's not doing a very good job of proving it.
Right. It's right. It is certainly not advancing, I think, the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That's from the UN Charter, and I don't think it's making any progress in that direction. Let's talk about Yemen, but let's widen the aperture. Historically, has Yemen always been as balkanized as it appears to be right now? It seems, why did it not become part of Saudi Arabia? It's the southernmost part of Arabia. Is that because of religious differences, or anyhow? When I first became cognizant of Yemen, I thought it was kind of a wonderful, exotic place. It was interesting architecture and mountains in the background, and, kind of wonderful. But you must know the history of it in a way I don't.
I mean, on some level, of course, it is all of those things. It was known by the Romans as Arabia Felix.
Happy Arabia.
Blessed Arabia.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. It wasn't desert. It was,
It was fertile land. It had mountains. It was beautiful. And, of course, it has a far more ancient civilization than any other part of the peninsula. Mm-hmm. And so, in many ways, Yemen was, and of course, Yemen was an imamate. It was a political entity, again, long before there was any formed political entity further north in the Arabian Peninsula. And as for why the Saudis don't control Yemen, well, the process by which Saudi Arabia came together, which is actually not that long ago, of course, it didn't actually allow for the colonization of the far corners of the peninsula. The peninsula is huge, and there are all of these very, very significant geographical barriers, the Great Sand Sea, and then all of those mountains. So I think that's the reason. But Yemen has always been troubled in one way or another. One of the problems has been this sort of sense of God-given right of the Zaidi community, which is, as you sort of hinted, religious differences. The Zaidis are Shia adjacent. They're not, they're not exactly Shia, but they identify themselves as not being Sunni.
And the Houthis are Zaydis.
And the Houthis are from the Zaidi community. That's right.
Right. And as long they're from the Zaidi community, they're not. It's not exactly the same.
It's partly very specific to a part of northern Yemen. So there is a town of Houth. And the Houthis were very heavily concentrated in the furthest north governorate of Sada and its neighboring governorate to the south. One way of describing the Houthis is a Zaidi revivalist cult. So, sort of almost like a self-appointed elite within the Zaidi community. And they've only been in existence for 40 years or so, and they were heavily
40 years as a Houthi rebellion, you mean?
As a Zaidi revivalist movement.
As a revivalist movement. Okay.
Yeah. So initially that was not exactly a rebellion. Of course it does go back all the way to the latter years when Yemen was a divided country anyway. You had North Yemen,
right,
and you had South Yemen.
And that division was based on what? What were the differences?
Well, there was a civil war in the 1960s. You'll be aware of the British protectorate of Aden in the far south, and of course the Egyptians got involved in this. There was a sort of a proxy war, strangely enough, between Saudi Arabia once again, and in this case the Egyptians backing the different sides in this Yemeni civil war, and it settled down into a stable, more or less stable division of Yemen into the Yemeni Arab Republic in the north and the People's Democratic Republic of the Yemen in the south and east of the country. And that was because of the Cold War. that had a certain stability about it. I wouldn't say PDRY was a sort of, it was, in many ways, it was just as much an Arab country as it was a communist country or socialist country. But
more secularized because it was communist?
Definitely more secularized. Yeah. Yes, exactly so. And the Yemeni Arab Republic in the north was more of a traditional Arab nationalist, but with, fairly strong religious identity below the surface. And then there was the great reunification. And of course, when we think of reunification around about 1990, we always think of Germany because that was the great one.
Right.
But we got, people forget that was when Yemeni reunification happened as well at the end of the Cold War. And there was a brief moment of optimism in Yemen that there was going to be a brighter future.
And that reunification was brought about by what? Was there a leader who was very charismatic, or what was the reason for we know the reason for German reunification, right? The Soviet Union had collapsed. East Germany was poor. West Germany was rich. People talked about it as reunification, but really it was West Germany taking over East Germany, I always thought.
Yeah, so there is a parallel with Yemen. I wouldn't say that the PDRY was as weak or as discredited as East Germany was. But even so, the communists had lost the Cold War. And so the ideology of PDRY felt irrelevant. And it was indeed the leader of North Yemen, the Yemeni Arab Republic, who took over as president of the entire country. But of course, that man was Ali Abdullah Saleh. And Ali Abdullah Saleh was a catastrophically bad leader. Now, charismatic he was, and, on some level, he was the sort of the dominant figure, the obvious person that they would choose as their leader at that time. But his list of bad decisions is one of the longest in the whole history of Arab leaders.
What kinds of bad decisions? Economically, or
So it was a whole range of them.
Okay.
And the one to start with is, as I said, there was a moment of optimism in 1990. Hey, we're now all friends. We're one country. Yemen could have a great future. It was a matter of weeks before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And Ali Abdullah Saleh looked at this and said, I think the best thing I could do is to become an uncritical supporter of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. And that, on its own, blew up Yemen's potential immediately because it made an enemy of the entire Gulf region. Saudis were horrified and completely, because from Saudi Arabia's point of view, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was a direct threat to Saudi Arabia. And from Ali Abdullah Saleh's point of view, he was looking at Saddam Hussein and saying, he's a bit like me, he's a strong man, he's
is he a Sunni, Saleh?
Saleh, no, he's a Zaidi.
He's a Zaidi, but he's still okay with Saddam Hussein, who's a Sunni.
Yeah. So one of the key things to think about with Yemen is that until the Houthis sort of started to polarize the country, the gap between the Zaydis and the Sunnis was not that great in Yemen.
See.
Because as I said, the Zaydis are Shia adjacent, but they're not Shia.
They're not, but they're good enough Shia for the Islamic Republic of Iran as long as they have the same enemies.
Exactly,
right?
good enough for them. But it used to be that Zaydis and Sunnis would actually the Sunni branch in Yemen are the Shafa'is. The Shafa'is and the Zaydis, they would worship in each other's mosques.
Interesting.
And they would marry each other without any need for anyone to convert to anyone else's way of thinking. There was a very high level of accommodation there. So Ali Abdullah Saleh didn't think in religious terms. He just looked at Saddam Hussein and said, he is an Arab nationalist strongman, and he's a lot like me.
Right.
And he also looked at the territory between Iraq and Yemen and said, well, what if he had the northern half and I had the southern half? That would work, wouldn't it? And of course, from the point of view of the Saudis and, the Omanis, the other Gulf states, this was, an appalling betrayal of the peninsula. And they felt threatened by it. And of course, Yemen, it was already a poor country. It desperately needed support from other Arab countries, and that meant that it didn't get any. And it lost all of its international credibility because Saddam was confronted in Kuwait and defeated in Kuwait. And Ali Abdullah Saleh was left with that reputation of having picked the wrong side. Then, of course, you had the growth of Al-Qaeda in Yemen and, going up to the USS Cole and leading.
Right. That's 2000, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So
where Al-Qaeda terrorists on a boat hit the USS Cole and killed, 17 or so personnel. Yeah.
Exactly. So this alienated the United States even further because the United States looked at Yemen and said, you're incubating these extremists. You're not doing anything about it. You're giving them freedom of action. They've attacked our ship. And then, of course, that also then played into the run-up to 9/11. Now, 9/11 changed things because it forced everybody to change their stance on counterterrorism. So even countries that had been, hopelessly weak on that or even sympathetic to Al-Qaeda had to change their tune and had to fall in line with the international consensus under US leadership against Al-Qaeda. And Yemen did the same. So the Yemenis then did become counterterrorism partners for the United States and for the West. Not very good ones. They were very equivocal. People talked about a revolving door policy where the Yemenis would arrest somebody and then they'd be out on the street again. But one of the effects of that was to alienate the Houthis, because the Houthis, who were becoming increasingly shrill in their attitude to sort of Zaidi revivalism, we are the chosen people, they looked at Ali Abdullah Saleh, and even though he was a co-religionist, they regarded him as a bad Muslim. He wasn't really, much of a Muslim. He was, as I say, he was an old-fashioned Arab nationalist. And they particularly resented the fact that he had agreed to cooperate on counterterrorism with the United States. And of course, the Houthis, being under the influence of Iran, regarded that as a betrayal. And so they started to become increasingly restive in the north of Yemen. And Saleh launched a series of military expeditions against the Houthis, which people sometimes refer to as the First Houthi War, the Second Houthi War, the Third Houthi War. All of this was going on roughly between about 2004 and 2010. And all of these Yemeni military expeditions were unsuccessful. So the Houthis started to gain a reputation as being good fighters and very, very resilient in the face of these attacks.
And they were, and the Saudis got involved, and they were still resilient.
Yeah.
And actually, I remember being, I don't know, in Saudi Arabia or maybe it was the UAE, and meeting actually an Australian Special Forces guy who was leading the charge against the Houthis, and he seemed very confident. But of course, then I thought, okay, well, he's going to take them out. He's working with the UAE and with the Saudis, I forget, and he knows what he's doing, But no, he failed eventually. Yeah.
I would say that nobody has shown signs of decisive success against the Houthis, apart from the moment when the Saudis had really thrown everything into it in 2018, and they looked as if the Peninsula Shield forces would take Hodeida port. And
right.
History might look rather different if that had gone ahead and had not been aborted as it was.
Aborted because they couldn't succeed, or aborted because...
So here is one of those turning points in history.
Yeah.
I never understood why the Saudis felt the necessity to deal with Jamal Khashoggi in the way that they did. In my view, that was a historic mistake as well as an appalling crime.
Right.
But the timing was incredibly unfortunate, because at that time, the the first Trump administration, had Saudi Arabia's backs in Yemen, and the Saudis were gradually advancing against the Houthis. And in my view, they would have taken the entire Red Sea coast. And if they'd done that, then these threats to shipping in the Red Sea would never have materialized. But instead, because the Khashoggi killing completely pulled the rug out from under the Trump administration's Saudi policy, and the Saudis suddenly felt themselves exposed to the chill wind of almost universal international opprobrium. They then were strong-armed into signing the so-called Stockholm Agreement at the end of 2018, whereby they agreed not to take Hodeida, and Hodeida was supposed to be put under the supervision of the United Nations. Well, guess how that worked out?
Right.
Very much like UNIFIL in South Lebanon.
Right. Okay. And so from there, the Houthis begin to take power in a significant portion of Yemen.
Yes, I would say that the best way to think of it is that that was the moment when the Saudis started to think, we've really got to get out of this at all costs because we don't have international support. It's damaging our reputation. It's draining our economic resources. And, the sooner that we can strike some kind of bargain with the Houthis to get out, maybe we'll pay them, money for reconstruction and things like that. And those kind of discussions have been going on for some years now between the Saudis and the Houthis. So effectively, with the Saudis now starting to put their pressure on the internationally recognized government of Yemen not to rock the boat, not to take unilateral steps that the Houthis find objectionable, because then that makes the Houthis angry and more hostile to their Gulf allies. That has meant that the Houthi position has tended to consolidate over the last 6 to 7 years. Until, of course, the Houthis decided at the end of 2023 that they wanted a slice of the Gaza conflict. And that meant that, in my view, they overreached. Now, of course, when I say they overreached, they have also been pretty successful in a way, because the campaign of intimidation in the Red Sea has worked.
Right.
It has decimated the use of the Red Sea, Suez Canal revenues for the Egyptians, and international commerce using that absolutely vital international shortcut.
Right.
So in a way, they've been successful. But of course, by doing that, they've also made an awful lot of enemies. Now, initially, the reaction of the Biden administration with Britain supporting was, I think it was a decent effort, but it just wasn't enough. And it was clearly not effective.
It was not effective, and they were using expensive interceptors to shoot down missiles, and that were much cheaper.
Precisely.
And anybody, you don't have to be a military expert to know that shooting down arrows is not the way to win a war. You need to shoot, at the very least, the archers, or better yet, how about those supplying arrows to the archers?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, the terms of engagement for the Brits and the Americans at that time were, as you say, very restrictive.
Very restrictive.
And I remember that occasionally there'd even be a press release saying we took out this many Houthi missile silos or whatever, and there were no casualties. As if that's a good thing.
Yeah.
We were really, really surgical because nobody was hurt. Well, when you have a military enemy, that is not a realistic objective. So, when the Trump administration came in, first of all, of course, we had an absolutely dramatic US escalation from late March through until early May. And in my view, that escalation was highly effective. Now, I think the US underestimated how effective it was, and the US got tired of it. And of course, there were reasons for that as well, because you alluded to the expense of this. And, again, the US was using extremely expensive military equipment, and you had a couple of disasters with planes tipping off aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
So there were various reasons why the US didn't want to sustain this for a very long time. But one of the things that happened during that period, which people seem to have mainly missed, was that the Houthi prosecution of the civil war in Yemen had to be put on hold because they were massing troops to lay siege to the city of Marib in central Yemen. But they realized that the Americans were now attacking with very, very relaxed rules of engagement. And if they massed troops outside Marib,
the Houthis now,
if the Houthis massed troops outside Marib, the Americans would simply shred them from the air. And that would have been a massive strategic blow to the Houthis, which I think America would happily have inflicted. So the Houthis had to disassemble their siege of Marib. They couldn't do it. They couldn't risk it in those circumstances. And that was a real achievement of that campaign. And also, it's true that I think the US really hurt the Houthis, and the Houthis were seeking a ceasefire by early May, which the Omanis duly delivered. And then, of course, we then saw a very serious Israeli escalation against the Houthis in August.
Just in August.
And that was also an interesting step change because the Israelis showed that it was possible to hurt the Houthi leadership directly.
Now, a couple of quick questions here. One is, we've heard for years how poor Yemen is, yet They may not have enough food in Yemen, but they sure have enough missiles. I'm guessing that all this comes from Tehran, that they're supplying the weapons, the munitions, the money. The Houthis are not going without meals. They're not starving to death. This is all from Tehran, yes?
Yes, the Iranians are absolutely central to this and instrumental in it. That's not to say that nobody else is supporting the Houthis.
Who else is there?
Well, the Houthis have had some support from Lebanese Hezbollah.
Okay,
but of course, that's happening
stopped.
anymore.
Yeah,
no,
right.
Exactly. Yeah, the Houthis have had some support from Russia, but delivered, but delivered through Iran. The Houthis have,
and the Russians are doing that just because. I mean,
because they're international outlaws, and it's in their interest to challenge the status quo.
Okay,
they don't have any ideological sympathy with the Houthis, but they're very happy to see the Houthis embarrassing the West.
And they're also the Russians are in bed with the Islamic Republic in Tehran.
Exactly. So there's a little bit of a quid pro quo going between the Russians and the Iranians. Exactly so. The Chinese are paying protection money to the Houthis so that the Houthis don't target Chinese ships. So they're getting some of that support. They've also been able to develop.
And Chinese ships are going through just fine now because just to tell the Houthis, lay off, we're coming through. Okay.
Exactly so. And
are the Chinese ships going through the Suez Canal too?
I believe so.
You believe so?
I don't
Okay.
have
No,
the
just
detail
there's not much traffic in the Suez Canal, but the Chinese can go there. Okay. Yeah.
Now, the other thing that's happened, I mentioned the sort of rapprochement that's happened between Iran and Al Qaeda. That has also involved a rapprochement in Yemen between the Houthis and Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the spin-offs from that is that AQ has helped the Houthis to develop a productive relationship with Al-Shabaab on the other side of the water.
In Somalia.
In the Horn of Africa.
In the Horn of Africa, right,
in Somalia, exactly so.
Yeah.
And this is very problematic because, there are some things that those two groups can do to support each other. And so, we're seeing a certain amount of mutual supply and training that's going on between those two. So the Houthis are trying to diversify their relationships, but Iran is still absolutely central. And the Iranians are getting stuff to them both by direct large-scale shipment, some of which have been intercepted recently, which has been interesting to watch.
Over the seas, is just trying to say.
Over the seas, coming into the port of Hodeida when they can.
Right.
There's also a lot of small dhow traffic that always exists in that part of the world, particularly at the southern end of the Red Sea and into the Arabian Sea. And then there's a significant amount of resupply that goes in overland through Oman. Now, this is one point on which, I think that the United States could definitely make a difference.
Yes.
I think if it were to take seriously the fact that the Sultanate of Oman has not really been acting as an honest broker in this conflict. The Omanis have become a bit too comfortable with the Iranians, and they're definitely a lot too comfortable with the Houthis. And of course, in Oman, you have the Ibadi sect, and there's a sort of a fellow feeling with the Houthis, as if to say, we're minority religious sects in a peninsula that's dominated by Wahhabi Saudis. And so we feel a little bit of, sympathy with them. We feel a little bit pro-Houthi and anti-Saudi. That's a sort of an emotional reaction that I've observed in some Omanis. And this has now grown to really quite troubling proportions. So there is a Houthi office in Muscat that I dealt with 10 years ago. And I brokered contact between the Houthis and the United States at a time when Britain had a relationship with the Houthis, but the Americans didn't for strange reasons. And at that time, I took advantage of the fact that the Omanis were hosting these Houthi negotiators in Muscat and providing, premises where you could hold negotiations. And that was all very nice. These days, that Houthi office in Oman, in Muscat, has grown to hundreds of people. And it is not just conducting diplomacy. It is also conducting procurement operations and liaison operations with the IRGC. And so this has become an absolutely key route of resupply for the Houthis.
And the U.S. has been ignoring this.
The U.S. and the U.K. both have very, very close relationships with Oman. We've always seen Oman as being a really important ally in the region.
Yeah, the Sultan Qaboos. Well, I met him years ago. He seemed rather moderate and pro-American, actually. Yeah,
he was, and indeed, in many ways, Oman has been a valuable ally for the United Kingdom and the United States. I don't want to understate that. But a friend can go to a friend and say, this has become a problem,
right,
and it has to be addressed.
And that's what the U.S. certainly should be doing at this point. One more question on this, and then we'll move on, and that is the status of the legitimate government of Yemen, because are they getting any support? Do they have any power? I'm unaware of what the status is, so I need you to educate me.
So in my view, there are two things that could put a stop to the Houthi threat, as in not just get them to make a tactical withdrawal and then start again 3 months later, but actually stop them, actually neutralize the threat. Now, one of those you alluded to earlier, and that is to hold Iran responsible for what the Houthis do. And of course, President Trump has explicitly threatened to do that. So one possible way of approaching this problem is to say to the Iranians, whenever the Houthis do something illegal or aggressive, we will take some kind of kinetic action against the IRGC or against Iranian state interests. And eventually you could potentially get to the point where the Iranians are saying to the Houthis, look, you're exposing us to risk and we can't manage that risk. And so we really need you to stop exposing us. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, it's a more painstaking option. And, one of the reasons it's difficult is because it was stopped 7 years ago at the time of the Stockholm Agreement. Right. But the other option is for the United States to take the lead in rebuilding a coalition to support the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Now, the internationally recognized government of Yemen is an imperfect beast. It's diverse. You've also got the Southern Transition.
Diversity isn't its strength.
Okay. Yes. In Yemen, I would say probably
not. Yeah.
But you've got the Southern Transitional Council. And so one of the things you're having to manage there is a tension that exists between the internationally recognized government and its Southern separatist allies who, on the one hand, agree with the government against the Houthis. But what they're saying is that eventually we're not going to want you to govern us either. We're going to want to have our own separate Southern government. But, that's not beyond the wit of man to manage that kind of alliance of convenience, because after all, the Houthis are a mortal enemy to both of those parties, and indeed to all of the parties of southern Yemen and eastern Yemen. So in my view, what is needed, and of course the Saudis may take some persuading on this because they've taken so much pain from it, but I think what is needed is for the United States to lead the building of a coalition, and the key members of that coalition need to be the Saudis and the Emiratis and possibly others. I would love to think that the Egyptians would be more helpful, given that they have so much to gain from stopping this Houthi interference with the Suez Canal. But of course, Egypt can be very difficult in that way. It can be
in many ways. Yeah,
it's not very biddable.
Yeah,
but it's still, I think, possible because people can see that the second Trump presidency has created certain opportunities. The change in Syria is real. Everyone can see it. The change in Lebanon is real, and everyone can see it. The defeat of Iran and its nuclear program is real, and everyone can see it, which means, in my view, that it is possible to do this and to revive this Yemeni front to push the Houthis away from the Red Sea coast. And the final thing I'll say on that is that there is also a natural justice in this, because where the international community went horribly wrong, particularly in 2018, but I felt it coming already when I was ambassador a couple of years earlier, and it's continued ever since 2018, is that having started off by clearly diagnosing that you had a legitimate government and that it had been displaced from the capital city and large parts of the country by an illegal extremist coup. Who are the good guys in this? There's no doubt. And the UN said the right thing. In 2014, you have Resolution 2140, which is absolutely crystal clear on this. The government is the legitimate government. The Houthis are an illegal coup. We are sanctioning the Houthis and their allies because they have done this illegal act. 2015, the Saudis joined the war on the side of the internationally recognized government under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Self-defense, absolutely legal, and not just legal, but also moral, ethical. And at that time, that was the moment that I took over as ambassador, there was no question being asked in London or in Washington about who were the good guys in this conflict and who were the bad guys. And yet, by 2018, that international perception had reversed, and people were starting to talk about the Saudis as bullies and oppressors, and the Houthis as plucky, resistant fighters. And so, let's go back to that original diagnosis. If you took a poll of the Yemenis, the vast majority of them would say the Houthis are the worst leaders, the worst. I don't want to call them a government because they're not a government, but
they rule.
Yeah, the worst de facto rulers that we have ever had. They're oppressive. They're cruel. They don't even pretend to represent the majority of the Yemeni population. They are a revivalist cult from within the minority group of the Yemeni population, and therefore, we can win this argument on moral grounds as well as on legal grounds.
All right, last subject for today. I want you to explain to me a little bit about what's going on in Britain. For example, UK Judge Sir Robert J. Wished convicted al-Qaeda terrorists who killed 52 in London bus bombings, quote, all the best, as he prepared to let them walk free. He sympathized with the al-Qaeda terrorist Harun Aswad, who'll be released from the hospital without ankle tag monitoring because of a loophole which forbids checks on psychiatric patients, despite police fears he remains a threat. And then we have Shaban Mahmoud, the new Home Secretary. She's responsible for UK internal security, public safety, immigration, including counterterrorism. From what I can tell, may tell me if I'm wrong, she's pretty much Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, I don't know if she's Muslim Brotherhood.
She's certainly, of course, well, maybe I am going too far by saying that, but I don't think she's unsympathetic to Islamism, as I would say. Anyhow, listen, people I know have been worrying about it for some time. Melanie Phillips is an old friend of mine. You may know Melanie.
Yes.
She wrote Londonistan back in 2006, how Britain is creating a terrorist state within, by British, anyhow, a terrorist state within Britain. Talk to me about what's going on in Britain now, because it worries Anglophiles like me.
So the fundamental premise of your question is right. Britain has a problem, and it has a problem because it has been complacent about the impact of mass immigration over a prolonged period. And, of course, we all need immigration. It's healthy within an economy. It needs to be managed, and you need to think about integration issues and those sorts of things. And I've always rather admired the policies of, you could argue that the Australians and New Zealanders have certain advantages because of being, sort of far distant island states. And it's a little bit different from if you're France, for example, and you've got, borders in all directions, and you enter something like the Schengen Agreement and you don't even try to enforce the borders that you do have. So it is the migration challenge, I think, manifests in different ways in different countries. The problem I think that we've seen in Britain, this warning about Londonistan, is not a new one. I remember receiving those warnings from the Egyptians when I was posted in Cairo in the 1990s.
Wow.
So this has been going on for 30 years. And the Egyptians warned us in the starkest terms about what we were incubating with the Muslim Brotherhood. And to my frustration, when I would transmit the reports back to London and say, look, the Egyptians say that they see a real problem here, I would get a very complacent response, which would be, well, they just don't like political oppositionists. The people that are in London because they're not safe in Egypt because Egypt would arrest them and torture them and whatnot. Now, that's not entirely untrue, of course. The Egyptian record of political freedom isn't great, and their record of brutality in detention is not great either. So it's not that the people in London were completely wrong, but what I detected was an extreme laziness behind this as well, because you always felt like you had too much to do. We've got so much to do with Al-Qaeda. We've got so much to do with Hezbollah. We've got so much to do with, the challenge that's been presented now in the Balkans or whatever it was at the time. And so I think this has been true generally of intelligence communities in the West. They've not wanted to deal with what people sometimes refer to as non-violent Islamism. They've wanted to say that's someone else's problem. Department of Communities, local government, Department of Education, someone like that. Just don't bring it to us because we've got too much else on our plate. And what has happened in the process is that a lot of these Islamist what are sometimes called entryist groups, finding their way into a country and then into positions of influence in the police, in the civil service, as teachers, as university lecturers.
Increasingly as voting blocks.
As voting blocks, as doctors. This has been going on, as I say, for 30 years and probably more than 30 years. And you find something in parallel in the United States, of course, and certainly in Canada, certainly in France, in Germany, and a range of other European countries. And the question is, at what point do you wake up to what's happened? Now, in my view, the 7th of October 2023 was a gigantic wake-up call. And, of course, it was partly a wake-up call specifically about Hamas. It was partly a wake-up call specifically about Iran and the Iranian proxies. But it was also a wake-up call about what had happened to the, if you like, the organized Islamist approach to international issues when in a crisis. And I think it's probably fair to say that in each successive Middle Eastern crisis over the past, let's say, since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, I would say that the sharpness of the reaction of predominantly Muslim communities, but also Muslim communities in association often with hard left communities in the West, has become more and more, it's become sharper and sharper and better organized and more numerous. And what we've seen since the 7th of October 2023 has been an extraordinary persistence of vexatious mass demonstrations in many Western countries. But very definitely in the United Kingdom. And that is
by the leftist Islamist coalition.
Exactly so. And carrying their Hezbollah flags.
Right. And carrying Hamas flags. And
chanting, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around, etc. So now in the UK, you don't have First Amendment protections. And Hezbollah is a proscribed terrorist organization. The police can arrest and charge somebody just for carrying a Hezbollah flag. But they don't. Or I shouldn't say they don't. They didn't. So for a long period, this continued, and it caused mounting dismay amongst many Brits, myself included, calling ourselves, I suppose, a silent majority who are saying, hang on, this cannot be right. First of all, this is a foreign conflict. It shouldn't be causing London to grind to a halt with all of the associated vandalism, damage, and commercial sort of, tax that it represents. And this should not surely be allowed to happen week after week after week. And the police do have discretion to curb demonstrations or to force them to go to less disruptive locations. But the police weren't doing it. And this has started to arouse concerns in the UK, first about anti-Semitism, because of the fact that many of these demonstrations then targeted Jewish institutions, the synagogues, community centers, Jewish businesses. You ended up with vandalism, swastikas being drawn, anything that was associated with Israel being attacked. So there was the anti-Semitism issue that sort of came very much to the fore at that time, and which also mobilized a great deal of decent British opinion that this is wrong, this cannot be allowed. We can't have people defacing synagogues. That's we're talking about 1930s stuff here, and at the same time, it led to a sense that because the Iranians are so obviously our enemies. And you had this sort of endless marching in support effectively of Iran's allies. And the police were not doing anything about it. They wouldn't arrest people. And then when counter-demonstrators would appear, the police would sometimes arrest them. Then there was a terrible tragedy that happened in the UK, I believe it was late last year, which was the Southport killings. Some young girls were killed effectively by I guess you could say he was a madman, more or less. But the police tried to obscure his identity and obscure the fact that he had at some point accessed some Islamist propaganda online. And that led to a counter-reaction in the UK that was itself very ugly. But this is the danger if you don't treat your population as adults, and if you think that you can sort of ration information because they can't be trusted not to draw the wrong conclusion if you tell them what you know, what that actually has is the exact opposite effect. It collapses public trust in the honesty of the authorities. So there were then horrific riots that took place, and they targeted migrant hostels, and that in itself led to a police crackdown and to a lot of prosecutions. And some of those prosecutions were certainly justified. Problem was that people then started saying, we see a double standard here in the way that the laws are being enforced, and that the police are very quick to crack down on crime on one side of this divide, if you want to turn it into a polarized divide, and not on the other side. I think most of us would want to say, surely what we're looking for here is the common sense middle ground, a robust defense of liberalism, which would completely reject racist attacks on immigrants, but would also completely reject vexatious marches that target synagogues. So I think the British police have got this very badly wrong. Now, I've seen some signs of the British political establishment starting to get it right. They're not there yet, but the proscribing of Palestine Action as a terrorist group was actually a very strong statement of intent. And a lot of those people have now been arrested.
And by the way, David Lammy coming out and saying if he was foreign minister, or to call it foreign secretary,
yes,
saying, by the way, he did it at a time that didn't get a lot of publicity, but saying the Israelis are not committing genocide. We have no evidence of that. That's not, he said they're not. He declared they're not.
Absolutely.
Again, didn't do it the most forthright way, but he did do it, which was, anyhow, a cause for some optimism. At least he's not slandering the Israelis in this case.
Exactly. But I think there is a problem here, and that is Labour's electoral calculations. They worry about the Islamic vote. And that means that they're always looking to balance anything that they do. So if you outlaw Palestine Action, you then also maybe think, would it be a good idea to recognize a Palestinian state?
Right.
Now, in my view, that is an extraordinarily bad decision. I said to someone who asked me earlier today, I think it's the worst British decision relating to the Middle East of my lifetime, or at least of the time that I have been following the Middle East.
It's recognizing something that doesn't exist.
It's recognizing something that doesn't exist. It's rewarding terrorism. And it's creating a positive incentive for Hamas not to release the hostages.
Right. And if they don't release the hostages, the conflict doesn't end.
And it's also flying in the face of Britain's most important ally, the United States, and undermining the only country, the United States, that is actually engaged in a constructive approach to the conflict.
Okay, so I promise my very last question for today. We don't know a lot about the Israeli attack on Hamas headquarters in Qatar. But what's your takeaway from this at this point on September 11th?
So, I mean, it's new and interesting. This is not attacking the Houthis in Yemen. It's not attacking Hamas or Hezbollah leaders in Syria or Iran. The GCC is a different environment. And I think there are a few things we will need to unpack in terms of what that means, for example, in relation to the Abraham Accords, in relation to the United States' strategic interests in the Arabian Peninsula, and all of those sorts of things. I think the first thing I want to say about it, though, is that I don't have a problem with the reasons why the Israelis did it. I mean, I think the Qataris have sheltered for a very long time now behind the idea that they are negotiators and honest brokers. In this conflict, they are not honest brokers. They are absolutely party pre. They are totally pro-Hamas. And they are, through Al Jazeera, they've been supporting Hamas throughout this conflict.
Yep.
They haven't had any success at all, really, in terms of negotiating an acceptable outcome to the conflict. In some cases, you've got Hamas terrorists who put on press vests and claim to be, moonlighting for Al Jazeera or moonlighting for Hamas. I'm not sure which way round it is. And so, and then, perhaps most egregious of all, if you have negotiators, fine, you can keep them in a compound somewhere, quiet compound. They can be comfortable, but preferably not the lap of luxury. Don't think they need to be billionaires. And they can be kept there, and they can then be available to meet with foreign delegations in pursuit of a peace process. But instead of that, they are billionaires. They are living in, the sort of the lap of luxury and opulence. They're very, very visible. They're on the media all the time. After the 7th of October, they were actually on the media celebrating the attack with the Iranian foreign minister. And more recently, of course, they were on the media celebrating the attack in Jerusalem. So, in my view, the Qataris have put them. They've been courting the mantle of a state sponsor of terrorism.
Right.
And in my view, that also courts the risk that is associated with being a state sponsor of terrorism.
This has been fascinating. This has been, I've learned a huge amount. So glad to have you here for this program and to have you at FDD. And I look forward to talking again. Thank you, Edmund.
Thanks, Cliff. It's been a great pleasure.
And thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.